رسول تبریزی هستم. در سال 1360 به جرم هواداری از سازمان مجاهدین دستگیر شدم.
I am Rasoul Tabrizi. I was arrested in 1981 for being a supporter of the People's Mojahedin organization, MEK. I was sentenced to 10 years in prison in a trial that took just a few minutes.
بعد از زندان اوین به زندان قزلحصار منتقل شدم. 5 سال تو زندان قزلحصار بودم.
From Evin Prison, I was transferred to Qezelhesar Prison, where I spent 5 years, and in 1986 I was returned to Evin Prison. There, I spent almost 2 years in various wards of Evin Prison. In February 1988, after the prisoners were sorted based on their sentences, I and a few others who were sentenced with over 10 years of imprisonment were transferred to GoharDasht Prison to face punishment.
ما تو فریای گوهردشت بودیم. ماها که مصادف شد با تقریبا پذیرش قطعنامه آتش‌بس به وسیله خمینی. بعد از پذیرش
Before the massacre took place, we were in one of the GoharDasht subsections, which coincided with Khomeini's reception of the ceasefire in the war he waged with Iraq. The day after Khomeini accepted the UN resolution, we felt that the conditions had become a little unusual, and they transferred us to a place that was actually part of the jihad ward.
قسمتی از بند جهاد بود که ما از همون روز اول شروع کردیم به اعتصاب کردن و حاضر نشدیم که اونجا بخوایم بمونیم و همونجا زندگی کنیم که
We went on hunger strike on day 1, and we didn't want to stay there. Meanwhile, the guard who brought us food told us to stay and keep our mouths shut as this was a good place.
ولی ما گوش نکردیم و همین داستان ادامه داشت که تا یه روزی فکر میکنم 15 یا 16 مرداد ماه بود که ناصریان اومد.
But we didn't listen to him, and the same story continued until August 6th or 7, when Nasirian came along with Hamid Abbasi, Nuri, and Davoud Lashkari and a few other revolutionary guards. They said that those who do not want to stay in this ward should come out. We all left that place, and we were called one by one in a room and were questioned about our charges. There were 60 of us who said that we were accused of being sympathizers of the MEK, and we were separated from the others. They took us to solitary confinement in the main part of GoharDasht Prison.
2 روز انفرادی بودیم که بعد از 2 روز فکر میکنم اشتباه نکنم 18 مرداد بود که برای اولین بار ما توی راهروی مرگ رفتیم. تو راهروی مرگ یه شرایط خیلی عادی بود که هیچ وقت سابقه نداشت که تو زندان این همه سفت و سخت رو مسائل امنیتی تکیه می‌کردن و بین هر نفری 2 متر.
After 2 days of being in solitary confinement, if I'm not mistaken, it was on August 9th that they took us to the death corridor for the first time. There was a very unusual situation on death row. I'd never seen that they'd insist on security issues in prison that much. They forced us to keep a distance between each person for about 2 meters, and the number of guards present was high. People were not allowed to talk and communicate while we were all blindfolded. Previously, we used to be able to look under the blindfold to see what was going on around us. There was absolute silence there.
بعد از ساعت‌ها اونجا نشستن یه پاسداری اومد از پشت لباسم گرفت، در گوشم اسممو گفت و بلند کرد. رفتم به سمت اتاقی که هیئت مرگ تو اونجا مستقر بود. بعد همینجوری که وارد اتاق شدم
After sitting in the same corridor for hours, a revolutionary guard came to me and called my name. He took me to the room where the death commission was sitting. When I entered the room, I was standing blindfolded, and as much as I could figure out, I understood that there was a table in front of me with piles of files on it, so that the person sitting behind it seemed as if he was buried under these files. As I looked a little under the blindfold, I was able to get to know Morteza Shragi and Hossein Ali Nayeri.
سمت چپ نیری رئیسی و پور محمدی نشسته بودن. یه میز الشک بود که این قسمتش هم ناصریان بود و بعدها فهمیدم اون صدای حمید عباسی یا حمید نوری فعلیه و داوود.
I think Ebrahim, Raisi and poor Mohammedi were sitting on the left side of Nairi. The table was L-shaped, and Nasirian, Hamid Abbasi, Nuri, and Dawood Lashkari were sitting behind it. They asked me about my charges, and I answered that I was a supporter of the organization. Eshraghi asked me what organization? And I replied that I was a supporter of the same organization that we all know.
اونجور که الان ما شنیدیم اونایی که حکم اعدام میگرفتن یه سمت وای میستادن، از سمت دیگه میبردن به سمت حسینیه برای اعدام و بقیه هم که چیز نبودن موقت بند دوباره انفرادی بود. همین داستان ادامه داشت که دیگه ما متوجه شدیم که مسئله اعدام ها به طور جدی.
As I heard from the others, those who had death sentences were lined up on one side of the wall, and they were taken to Hosseinieh, where they were executed. The rest were temporarily sent back into solitary confinement. This went on, and we started to realize that the executions were being carried out in earnest. During this period, newspapers, television, and even family visits were not allowed, and we lost track of the outside world. A few months later, when the execution stopped, Hamid Abbasi, Nuri, came to our ward and wanted to speak to us. He began saying things like he was asking God and his Imam Khomeini for forgiveness. He was asking to be forgiven that they did not fully execute the fatwa and failed to kill some of us.
بعد رو به ما کرد گفتش که این حکم هنوز پابرجاست، کوچکترین خطایی انجام بدین، کوچکترین اعتراض رو یا هنوز بفهمیم که سر موضع هستین، این حکم رو سریعا اجرا میکنیم و
Then he turned to us and said that the sentence still stands and that if we commit the slightest mistake or protest or if they find out that we are still loyal to our beliefs, they would carry out this sentence immediately. Then he said, if they would have properly execute their Imam Khomeini's fatwa, they should have arrested and executed half the ordinary people outside the prison. With these words, he wanted to deter and imply the same atmosphere of terror inside the prison. He wanted to highlight that the sentence was still in place, and the authorities could execute people whenever they'd please.
میخواست که تو زندان حاکم باشه و اینکه حالا الان دارم میشنویم که مثلا دارن تو همین جریان دادگاه حمید نوری یا بعضی از موضوعان میخوان ربط بدن این قتل عام 67 رو با عملیات فروغ که رژیم در تلافی عملیات فروغ میخواسته این کارو کنه.
When some people try to tie the trial of Hamid Nouri and the 1988 massacre to the NLA's armed operation inside Iran, as if the regime had retaliated the MEK's actions, I would say that is wrong. Since 1986, or even since 1986, the cruel Asadullah Lajavardi announced that one day, if they'd realize that the MEK wants to come and release the prisoners, then they'd drop a grenade in every cell and make sure no one is going to leave the prison alive.
اون که زمان لاجوردی بود. بعد از اونم که از سال 65 مرتب بچه‌ها رو که برای بازجویی و مسائل مختلف بند و تشکیلات بند بیرون می‌بردن.
Since 1986, when prisoners were regularly taken for interrogation, the interrogators affiliated to the Minister of Intelligence specifically pointed out in different ways that one day they'd settle with us and take care of us for good.
خواهیم کرد. حتی مسعود مقبلی رو برده بودن کمیته مشترک سابق و اونجا
When Masood Mobali was taken to the former Joint Committee, he was told that the regime had some plans for the prisoners and that they had categorized us into 3 groups: red, yellow, white. He said that they'd beat the reds once, they'd take care of the yellowish and that they might release the whitish. He was asked to go and tell others that we were coming for them.
یا یه روزی نماینده منتظری آخوندی بود به اسم حسین انصاری اگه اشتباه نکنم.
Once, the representative of Ayatollah Montazeri, named Hossein Ansari, had seen the prisoners, and when they told him about what was going on inside the prison, he had said that there was nothing they could do and that we should take care of ourselves. He warned them that the prison authorities had some plans and they had used the equipment they found in our wards as proof that the prisoners wanted to rebel. He told us about the conspiracies and asked the prisoners to be careful.
پس این نشون میده همه این فاکتا و شواهد که هیچ ربطی به عملیات فروغ جاویدان نداشته. قتل عام و نسل‌کشی که در سال 66 راه انداختن. برنامه بود که از سال 65 و 66 به طور جد دنبالش بودن. حتی
These facts and evidence show that the massacre and genocide they launched in 1988 had nothing to do with the MEK's armed conflict, and this was a plan that they had been seriously pursuing since 1986 and 1987. The genocide was even supposed to take place in the autumn and winter of 1987, but for some reason, this was postponed to 1988.
با توجه به روندی که ما خودمون تو زندان شاهد بودیم به هیچ وجه ربطی به عملیات فروغ نداشت. دقیقاً به خاطر اینکه صورت مسئله رو خمینی صورت مسئله زندان رو برای همیشه براشون حل بکنه دست به این جنایت دست به این نسل‌کشی زد و خیلی از بچه‌هایی که عمدتاً حکم داشتن حکمای از چند سال تا حکمای ابد و همه اون بچه‌ها طبق
Therefore, given the process we witnessed in prison ourselves, the executions had nothing to do with Operation Eternal Light. Precisely because Khomeini wanted to solve the year-long prison sentence for his regime, he committed this genocide and crime, and many of the children who had been sentenced to life sentences ranging from a few years to a life sentence, all of these children were sentenced to 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and were convicted. But at that time, without facing a new crime, they were charged in a few minutes trials with a very short question or answer, especially on days when only the charges were questioned as we heard, and it was enough to say that the MEK and sympathizers of the MEK, then without any questions or answers, would have been signed in their death sentences.
در جا حکم اعدامشون امضا میشد. خب توی همچین شرایطی توی همچین چیزی جز نسل‌کشی جز واقعا قتل عام کسانی که حکم داشتن بخش عمده‌ای از زندان و حکمشون رو طی کرده بودن. من خودم 7 سال اون موقع زندان بودم. بچه‌های دیگه هم همینجور 7 سال 6 سال بعضا بچه‌هایی که از سال 59 دستگیر شده بودن و حکمشون بعضا 2 سال بود 3 سال بود تموم شده بود معروف ملی.
This was nothing but genocide, a massacre of those whose sentences were determined and who had served part of their sentences in prison. I was in prison for 7 years. Other prisoners had a sentence of 6 years, 7 years, or people who had been arrested since 1980. Sometimes, people had finished their sentences and were still kept in prison because they refused to give televised interviews to denounce their organization and beliefs. They executed prisoners who were arrested in 1980. Some prisoners had been arrested because they were doing political activities and whose sentences had expired. Also, those who were sick or who had suffered severe mental health problems due to the high pressures in prison were executed. There was Nasser Mansouri, who committed suicide due to severe pressure from prison guards. He had thrown himself down from the second floor and had been paralyzed due to spinal cord damage. They took him to the death commission on a stretcher, and after a minute or two, he was carried to the gallows on the same stretcher.
در یک دقیقه 2 دقیقه حد اکثر از هیئت مرگ میان رو با همون بلانکارد میبرن. بچه‌هایی بودن که بیماری‌های شدید داشتن. محسن فامیلیش متاسفانه یادم رفته که مادرزاد فلج بود همیشه با 2 تا عصا راه میرفت.
There were people with severe illnesses, such as Mohsen, whose surname I forgot. He was congenitally paralyzed and always walked with 2 crutches. All these crimes and atrocities and the execution of 30,000 young freedom-loving people, who wanted nothing but the freedom of their own people, happened in 2 months based on the same fatwa of Khomeini. More than 200 to 300 of whom we lived together in the ward, through hardships and joy, were executed. We were all in this together. Why have they been executed? I have asked this question for more than 30 years, why my friends were killed.
و حتی خیلی از خانواده ها اکثر خانواده ها هیچ نشانی از اینکه بچه هاشون کجا دفن شدن، نه قبری دارن، نه آدرسی دارن، نه میدونن کجا باید برن سر خاک عزیزان.
Many families have no indication of where their children are buried. These families do not know where to go to mourn their loved ones. For years our families have endured this pain.
خانواده اون شهدا نمیدونن. خیلیا مثل پدر مسعود مقبلی بعد از شنیدن اینکه پسرش اعدام کردن، آقای مقبلی هم
Many family members were shocked, like Masood Mobili's father, who had a heart attack when he heard his son had been executed. He died afterward. Many mothers or fathers had a heart attack after hearing about their children's execution, and many suffered serious illnesses after they had such as strokes and became stranded. Some are still looking forward to the day that they will open the door, and someone will step in and give them information about where they can find their children.